800 feet below the Earth's surface, in New Mexico's most extensive cave system, they found fresh footprints in the mud. No one had mapped this section in decades. I am the Nightmare Maestro, and tonight's tale will make you question what truly dwells in the darkest corners beneath our feet. Professional spelunker Dr. Carol Davis had explored hundreds of caves across 6 continents, but something about this particular system in Carlsbad made her uneasy. The cave opening gaped like a maw in the dusty New Mexican landscape, exhaling stale, mineral-laden air that carried an oddly metallic taste. Her team of 4 experienced cavers stood ready with their gear, triple-checked and calibrated for the complex mapping expedition ahead. The Department of Interior had commissioned them to update the geological surveys of this previously unmapped section, following reports of unusual seismic activity. Their equipment included the latest ground-penetrating radar and 3D mapping technology. But it was the old-school redundancies, multiple backup lights, paper maps, and trail markers that Carol trusted most. 20 years of caving had taught her that technology had a way of failing when you needed it most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the limestone outcropping as Carol briefed her team one final time. Joshua, their geophysicist, monitored the seismic equipment with methodical precision. Elena, the team's photographer and secondary surveyor, checked her camera's moisture-proof seals. The Jackson twins, Tom and Anna, veteran cavers who specialized in tight space navigation, performed their characteristic synchronous equipment check, a habit that had always struck Carol as oddly mesmerizing. As they began their descent, Carol noticed something peculiar about the entrance chamber's acoustics. Their voices didn't echo quite right, as if the sound was being absorbed rather than reflected. The familiar limestone walls, normally a comforting sight, seemed somehow different here. The stratification patterns more angular, less natural. Her headlamp caught strange striations in the rock face that didn't match any geological process she'd studied. The first 100 feet went smoothly as they set their initial anchors and survey points. Carol marked their path with bright orange surveyor's tape, each strip carefully knotted and logged in her waterproof notebook. The temperature dropped steadily as they descended, but not in the gradual way she'd expected. Instead, it came in distinct steps, like crossing invisible thermal boundaries. By the time they reached the first major chamber, Carol's thermometer showed a 15-degree drop from their calculations. She made a note, but didn't share her concern with the others. After all, caves could be unpredictable, and hard data was better than speculation. 3 hours into their descent, the team reached their first major discovery. The narrow passage they'd been following suddenly opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness despite their powerful lights. But it wasn't the chamber's size that caught Carol's attention. It was the faint scuff marks on the otherwise pristine flowstone floor. These weren't ancient traces. The marks were recent, showing signs of modern boot treads. According to their permits, no other expeditions were authorized in this section. Carol documented the findings while her team set up a survey station. The air felt different here, drier than it should be at this depth, with an underlying smell that reminded her of copper pennies. Joshua's seismic equipment registered unusual readings, micro-vibrations that didn't match the normal patterns of cave settling or distant water movement. Elena's photographs revealed more oddities when reviewed on her camera's display. Subtle tool marks on some of the formations, too precise to be natural erosion. The Jackson twins found small cairns tucked into corners, deliberately placed but serving no apparent navigational purpose. As they worked, Carol noticed their first trail marker had changed position. now pointing down a different tunnel than the one they'd emerged from. She frowned, double-checking her notes. The tape had been securely fastened. It couldn't have moved on its own. The knot was different, too, tied in a way none of her team used. A nagging voice in her head whispered that something wasn't right, but they had a job to do. The chamber's acoustics played tricks with their communication. Words spoken on one side reached the other with unexpected clarity, while conversations just feet apart sometimes seemed muffled, as if the air itself was selectively transmitting sound. Their electronic equipment began displaying intermittent errors, brief glitches in the 3D mapping software, momentary spikes in the seismic readings, strange artifacts in Elena's digital photos that couldn't be explained by lighting or moisture. The discovery of modern traces transformed their scientific expedition into something more urgent. Carol's team found more evidence of recent human activity. A crushed water bottle, its label still legible, scratch marks on the walls that couldn't be more than a few months old, and most disturbing, a series of crude arrows carved into the rock, all pointing deeper into the unmapped tunnels. Joshua's seismic equipment began picking up patterns that defied explanation, rhythmic vibrations that seemed to pulse through the rock at regular intervals, like a giant subterranean heartbeat. Elena's camera captured strange light anomalies, lens flares that shouldn't be possible in the absolute darkness. The Jackson twins, usually unflappable, grew quiet as they noticed their survey markers repeatedly misaligning with their initial measurements. Their own trail markers continued to shift. Carol caught glimpses of orange tape disappearing around corners, only to find them relocated down unfamiliar passages. When she compared the placement photos Elena had taken, the timestamps made no sense. Markers photographed hours apart showed up in the same frame. The team's headlamps cast jumping shadows that played tricks with depth perception, making every crevice seem deeper than it was. The cave's natural formations began to take on unsettling shapes. Columns that looked too much like human figures, stalactites arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate. The mapping equipment started producing contradictory readings. The 3D rendering showed impossible geometries, passages that doubled back on themselves in ways that defied their physical tracking. Carol knew caves could be disorienting, but this was different. They were being led somewhere. The air grew thicker, charged with an electric tension that made their hair stand on end. The metallic taste in the air intensified, and their voices began to develop a strange resonance, as if multiple versions of themselves were speaking simultaneously. Tom Jackson discovered the first notebook, water-damaged but recent, its pages filled with rambling calculations and desperate observations about sound waves and geological impossibilities. The handwriting deteriorated as the pages progressed, eventually dissolving into frantic sketches of geometric patterns that made Carol's eyes hurt to look at. When Elena tried to photograph the notebook, her camera's memory card corrupted instantly. 6 hours into the expedition, they found it. A chamber that showed clear signs of habitation, a crude camp set up with empty food containers, battery-powered lanterns, and a wall covered in complex mathematical equations scratched into the limestone. The dates on the food packages were recent, within the last month. But it was the equations that made Carol's blood run cold. They were calculations about sound waves, frequencies, and resonance patterns. Interspersed between the numbers were phrases that made no sense. The deeper notes draw them, and sound shapes the rock. Their equipment began emitting a high-pitched whine, and the team's radio crackled with staticky interference that sounded almost like whispered words. Joshua attempted to decipher the equations, his scientific skepticism crumbling as he recognized advanced acoustical formulas far beyond typical geological applications. Elena's camera stopped working entirely, its screen displaying only cryptic error messages in fonts that didn't match any known character set. The twins reported that their backup compasses were spinning wildly, each pointing in a different direction. The chamber itself seemed to defy Euclidean geometry. Carol's laser measuring tool showed distances that changed with each reading, even though nothing visibly moved. The ceiling appeared to slope at impossible angles, creating visual paradoxes that induced vertigo in anyone who stared too long. Most disturbing were the personal effects scattered around the camp. Professional caving equipment, research-grade sensors, and journals from what appeared to be multiple expeditions, each ending abruptly mid-entry. Carol ordered an immediate pullback to their last verified position. But as they gathered their gear, they realized with growing horror that the chamber now had 6 exits instead of the 4 they'd entered through. Their trail markers had been completely rearranged, creating a maze-like pattern that led deeper into the unknown. The original path back to the surface was now impossible to determine. The team's attempt to retreat turned into a nightmare of circular logic. Every passage they took seemed to lead back to the equation chamber, but subtle details changed each time they returned. The equations evolved, the food packages multiplied, the exits shifted positions. Their mapping equipment showed they were somehow descending, even when they could swear they were climbing upward. Carol's geological training told her this was impossible. Caves don't change, rock doesn't move, but with each return to the chamber, the evidence became undeniable. Someone, or something, was manipulating their environment with impossible precision. The equations on the wall weren't just mathematical scribblings, they were instructions for reshaping the cave itself using specific frequencies and vibrations. Elena's camera suddenly began working again, but the images it captured showed versions of the chamber from hours ago, complete with their past selves still present in the frame. Joshua's seismic equipment recorded frequencies that he claimed couldn't exist in nature. Wavelengths that should have been too large for the chamber to contain. The twins, their usual synchronization now unsettling rather than comforting, simultaneously reported feeling movement in the rock walls, like muscles flexing beneath skin. As if responding to this realization, a low hum began to permeate the chamber. The sound vibrated at a frequency that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. The walls seemed to ripple like water, and in the shifting shadows they caught glimpses of movement. Other figures watching from newly formed crevices, their eyes reflecting the beam of their headlamps. The equations on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the humming. Carol recognized one of the observers from a missing persons report she'd read during their expedition preparation. A geophysicist who disappeared in these caves 3 months ago. But his face looked wrong, somehow more angular, as if it had been reformed by the same forces reshaping the cave. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, only that same resonant frequency emerged, causing small stones to dance across the chamber floor in complex geometric patterns. The chamber's hum reached a fever pitch as Carol watched Joshua scrawl equations with trembling hands. But something wasn't right about his movements. They were too precise, too mechanical. That's when she noticed the thin, nearly invisible filaments extending from his fingertips to the cave wall, like a puppet's strings made of crystallized mineral deposits. Elena's camera, captured the truth they'd been too blind to see. The cave wasn't reshaping itself, it was growing. The crystalline formations weren't decorative, they were functional, like a vast nervous system. The equations on the walls weren't instructions, they were a record of the cave's feeding process. Each formula represented a calculated extraction of human knowledge, drawn out through prolonged exposure to specific frequencies that crystallized neural patterns directly into the rock. The missing expeditions hadn't transformed or evolved. They'd been harvested. Carol's flashlight beam caught glimpses of shapes suspended within the crystalline walls. Human figures, perfectly preserved, their bodies serving as organic batteries powering the cave's expansion. Their brains had been systematically drained of expertise and experience, the knowledge absorbed into the mineral matrix of the cave itself. The transformed geophysicist wasn't transformed at all. He was a projection, a crystalline construct, using harvested memories to lure new victims deeper. As if confirming her realization, his form flickered momentarily, revealing the complex lattice of minerals beneath the humanoid facade. The cave didn't want collaborators, it wanted resources. Tom and Anna Jackson moved in perfect synchronization because they were already being integrated into the system, their twinned consciousness providing twice the neural energy. Elena's camera malfunctions weren't electromagnetic interference. They were the cave's attempts to access and copy the digital memories stored in its circuits. Carol's mind raced as the pieces fell together. The Department of Interior hadn't commissioned this expedition. The cave had. It had learned to forge documents and credentials, using absorbed bureaucratic knowledge from previous victims. Each expedition brought new expertise, geologists, engineers, physicists, all carefully selected to feed the cave's growing intelligence. Joshua's equations now covered his arms, the crystalline filaments spreading across his skin like frost. The numbers weren't random, they were a countdown. Carol lunged for her pack, remembering the one piece of equipment the cave couldn't have anticipated, an experimental ultrasonic drill prototype designed to shatter specific mineral frequencies. The transformed geophysicist's projection moved to stop her, but Carol had already activated the device. The high-frequency pulse hit the crystal lattice, setting up a devastating resonance cascade. The cave's network began to fracture, releasing decades of stored consciousness in a psychic backwash that slammed through Carol's mind like a tidal wave. She saw everything. The cave's birth from a single crystalline mutation decades ago, its first accidental feeding on a lost caver's brain, the methodical development of its luring techniques. Most horrifying were the memories of its current project, a plan to extend crystalline filaments through the water table, spreading its network to populated areas. The equations weren't just records, they were viral code, designed to infect and convert human architecture into extensions of the cave's crystalline mind. As the crystal network shattered, the preserved bodies began to crumble. Carol grabbed Elena's camera and the barely conscious Joshua, dragging them toward what she hoped was the surface. Behind them, the chamber collapsed as the cave's vast consciousness fractured, its accumulated knowledge scattering like mental shrapnel through the underground. 3 days later, a real search party found them huddled in a narrow fissure near the surface. The cave's main entrance had collapsed, sealing the horrors below. But Carol knew it wasn't over. In her pocket, Elena's camera held photos of the equations, and in her mind, she could still feel crystal filaments trying to grow. Somewhere deep in her consciousness, a small voice was already beginning to calculate the frequencies needed to start the process anew. Subscribe for more chilling tales from the Nightmare Maestro.